Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Industry Insights webinar series. My name is Stephanie, and I will be the moderator throughout today's conversation. In today's episode, we're going to be covering strategies and technologies that construction companies should be aware of. And with that, we have a couple experts to walk you through it all. But before we dive into the conversation, there's just a couple housekeeping items that I want to review. So first off, all attendees are going to be on mute throughout this conversation, but if you do have any audio or webcam issues with seeing our host, you can just let us know using the Ask Questions section on your screen. You can use that same section to ask our host questions today about the topic, and we will be answering those at the end in our Q&A. So feel free to ask a question at any time. We also want to let you know that this is being recorded, so if there's anything that you miss, you can definitely check it out on your own time. And then lastly, we will send you a link to that on-demand version of this webinar within the next 24 hours. I think that's all of the housekeeping items. So now I'm going to introduce our three hosts for today. So all three of these guys come from a sales background, so they're constantly helping organizations in several verticals, including construction. So first up, we have Mike Lepper. He's VP of Sales for our Southern Illinois region and a partner at Impact. Secondly, we have John Antwitz, who is the sales manager in our Madison, Wisconsin area. And last but not least, we have Marshall Clayton. He's our sales manager in the Los Angeles area. So with that, Mike, I'm just going to pass it over to you to get the conversation going.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everybody, for joining. With that all being said, let's dive right in. And Marshall, I'm going to start out with you first, just talking about what does construction on-site management actually involve?
Yes, thank you, Mike. I think a successful construction project really relies on the work of the site managers, the architects, engineers, laborers, or other various contractors or subcontractors that are involved in that project. There are often multiple projects that are happening at one time within the actual effort, and the coordination of those small projects making up the larger is very, very important to this vertical. It's really a monumental task for a construction business to keep a record of workers, staff, the processing of payments, monitoring the completion of jobs, managing contractor availability, and to forecast the cost and really budget for those projects. So as these buildings become increasingly connected and high tech, there will be even more complexity to deal with.
Okay, got it. Thanks for sharing. There's a lot of good points there. What does connected construction actually mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, I mean, as these buildings are becoming more and more high tech, you can go to stadiums, you can go into these larger high rises where the emphasis is on the engagement of the customer, the engagement of the patron. Majority of that is being directed to their devices. We live in a world right now where bringing your own device to a place is paramount. And most of the time, some of these people are going to have more than one of them, whether it's a watch, phone, tablet, etc. So accessing the data, sharing information through either the cloud or your devices is essential for these construction businesses because they are working through multiple sites and, again, multiple entities within those projects, being the regular contractors, the general contractors, or even the subs that they're communicating with.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, making sure that all of the data your people need on the job site is available and not siloed. This is a term we're going to continue to use a little bit throughout the webinar, but you want to make sure that you can get at all of your data through a single point of, or from a single source of truth, so that you're not finding that, okay, I have to log into 90 different systems in order to get 90 different pieces of information in order to do my job. And one of the things that we are going to continue to talk about here is the importance of having some oversight on all of that technology. Here at Impact, we offer VCIO services, which is Virtual Chief Information Officer. But what that person does is works with our construction company clients to make sure that all of our different pieces of information are working together effectively. And having that oversight is going to be make or break when it comes to having that effective plan in place to access that information. And And then on top of that, you want to make sure you're accessing all that data safely. So if everything is very accessible, if everything is in one place where people can get what they need on the fly, you also need to make sure that the right people are getting the right data. You need to know who can access that data, how they access it, and what kind of security is going to go all the way around that piece.
Yeah, that's a great point, John, and thanks for sharing. You know, the more connected we get, you know, the more secure that we need to be. So that's a great point. So why each of these elements, and what does this do for us, Marshall?
Yeah, I think it's really about empowering your people. You know, like I mentioned, and we're going to continue to talk about, there's a lot of different pieces on the board when we're talking about the construction vertical. There's going to be a lot of communication within each one of those entities that have been mentioned already. You have to track your materials, you have to track the right personnel, you have to make sure that they're at the same place at the same time, and everyone understands how efficiency is paramount with regards to this vertical. So for these tools that we're going to be talking about, it's really making sure that the team feels confident that they can get what they need when they need it, and then making sure from a organizational perspective within that construction vertical that it's secure.
Yeah, and we're talking about a lot of really large files. As everyone in the construction industry knows, you're dealing with CAD files, you're dealing with blueprints, you're dealing with a lot of these things that are massive, especially when it comes to accessing them on mobile devices. So we want to make sure that all of these things are available quickly without having to necessarily rely on outside communication sources. So a lot of times what we'll see on job sites, people using things like email and text messages and chat platforms in order to share these files, which sometimes these are protected by the construction companies, by your headquarters, and sometimes they're not. Trying to get rid of kind of the unofficial transfer of information moving between your people and make sure that it's all available on a quick, reliable source of information.
Yeah, I mean, they need to get the information wherever they can, right? It needs to be accessible to them in their handheld, on their tablet. And so they're not spending the entire day trying to figure out how are we getting this information? Do we even have the right information? So speed and efficiency, specifically as you're trying to coordinate the project dates and deliverables, it's extremely important for them, and they rely on it very, very heavily. I think a great example of this as far as just the exchanging of information, and we can get into this a little bit later as well, but you know, if you're a homeowner and you have someone working on your bathroom and you need someone to lay the tile, but someone to do the plumbing, and then someone to bring in the furniture and set all that up as far as, you know, your vanities and what have you, well, the timetable is actually set by, we have Aunt Sarah is going to be here in 2 weeks. We got to get all this done. That timetable is set. She's coming. So we got to make sure that all of this is set up properly, and those entities that are working on different things are communicating effectively. They know exactly what the timetable is. They've all communicated together and with you, and they make sure that we're on task so Aunt Sarah is ready to go when she gets there. Very important.
Makes sense. We want Aunt Sarah to be happy, right?
Absolutely.
So with all that being said, let's really break these things down, right? So what is mobile device actually involved then, Marshall?
Yeah, I mean, first off, we have to really identify, you know, what we have and where those devices are. I mentioned earlier, you know, this is an era of bringing your own device, having watches, having phones, having tablets. It's very important for organizations, specifically in construction, with multiple different projects going on at multiple different sites at one time, that they are able to coordinate who has the devices from the foreman down to the engineers, what access do they have to blueprints or task management for those projects, and where are all those devices if and when we need to manage them, if they're not working, if they're not turning on, heaven forbid someone drops it in some water. And we have to be able to navigate the support of those devices all across the projects. So I think effective management and using end-to-end enterprise mobility solutions really can lead to the success of a construction project. that mobile device management really allows for effective communication between all of the employees, the contractors, even the suppliers of the material, because we all know we're dealing with some logistical issues countrywide right now. And I think, being able to make sure that you're coordinating specific people for those projects that are sometimes being dictated by the availability of the material and sharing that information, the best way to do that is through a very progressive mobile device tool that's allowing us to share and make sure that that information is secure.
And that makes sense, right? And change, we all know, is good, but it can be difficult. So, a big question that I think most are probably asking themselves, well, how do they actually use it? How do we get there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's going to be the number one question, right? How is this going to work? Mobile security solutions really help handle the complexities of the construction project, really allowing the control of all the aspects of the project to be, uniform. So you're using these mobile applications on wireless devices. It lets the contractors monitor the progress of the projects, manage the plans, which ultimately then leads back to making sure you're budgeting properly for these projects. You're allocating the materials and the resources on the front end based on whatever that budget is. Mobile device applications will actually allow you to stay on task, leveraging that communication, the resources, and handling any issues that may arise, whether it's logistically or with regards to the resources, with really a lot of speed and efficiency.
That makes sense. And I'd like to jump in here, to make a couple quick points, just coming from a sales perspective, from my career. I think it's crucial that whether it's a new employee from an onboarding process or maybe somebody who's been with you for a long time, making sure that they actually understand how those tools operate, right? So whether it's from the onboarding, the foundational pieces that you put in play, or talking about that change, that I had brought up, like how do they use it, right? Change is difficult, but we change for the better of the organization and the better, output for your people. But I think making sure that, they're onboarded properly, they understand how to use the technology, there's checkpoints along the way, right? It's not just roll out the technology and let it be. You've got to bring them back sometimes into whether it's a classroom type setting or just, training in general. To make sure that they're keeping up from an educational perspective. But also you want to make sure, as much as you're enabling them, that you're making sure that all of our security parameters as an organization, are met. Because if we're not staying secure as an organization, all these tools will only hurt you, long term. So the way that I sum it up from my side is it's all about control, right? It's great, having all of this tech into the field, but then what? Right. So making sure that there's the processes and procedures in place from an internal perspective, coming from the top down, to make sure we're driving that from an organizational point.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think some of the cool technological advancements that are happening, in any vertical, but specifically construction, are these new virtual blueprint technologies, where they're really taking advantage of the mobile devices that they have all across these project sites. And what they've started to do is really be able to hone in on sharing the documents and more specifically when those documents are updated. Anybody in construction is going to talk to you about how often plans are changing, whether it's due to timeline, material availability, or just structurally. You might have your client that you're building the location for come in and say, actually, I want this door on this side of the office instead of here, or opening out instead of opening in. Something as simple and small as that. Well, in the old school days of construction, everyone's carrying around this big roll of blueprints, and every time there's a change, they had to go and reprint all of that out and then make sure that the new prints were distributed, and then make sure the communication to everybody was, hey, I'm calling you on the phone. Are you working off of, print 5-25 instead of 5-23 or whatever it may be, right? So these organizations in tech are starting to say, okay, not only can I give you the new blueprints on a device, but I can indicate, well, Mike, you're the one who I'm going to assign to this door to change it from one side to the other. I'm going to take a picture of it. I'm going to assign you that task in that technology. And then you're going to be able to indicate through your device on your end once you've completed that. So there's amazing technology and availability out there for these construction organizations. And again, it's all coming back to sharing as quickly as possible through the innovation on those devices.
Thanks, Marshall. John, I'm going to move over to your side. Everybody's talking about the cloud and managing it, but what does effective construction cloud management actually look like?
Yeah, so we get to play a little bit of good cop, bad cop here. Marshall can tell you all the different things that are great about the cloud and how these mobile devices can help you. I'm going to take a step back a little bit here and talk about what the effective management is, because there's a lot of things that get lost when you're looking at the cloud. It's absolutely wonderful for construction companies. It's the direction everything is moving, and its impact is cloud first when we talk to our clients. But there's a few things that really need to be spotlighted to make sure that you're doing these things correctly and not building yourself a technology debt. The first of which is data governance. So outside of construction, the business industry as a whole right now, everyone is really lockstep in on being able to do business intelligence. But the thing that very quickly derails all of those projects is having dirty data. Right now, every company is in kind of a position where people are storing their data in different places so that they can use it effectively and quickly. There is very few places that have a true data governance protocol in place, making sure that the right people are putting the right data in the right places. So this is something that becomes very, very important as you try to move into more and more cloud tools. Because what you'll find is that not all of these cloud tools play nicely together. They all have different back ends. And this is where we go back to one of the things I had mentioned earlier with these data silos. So let's say, for example, one of the biggest things that construction companies are moving into is cloud-based project management softwares. These are wonderful. They're great tools. Our VCIOs talk to our clients about them once every other week because everyone's looking for one that's going to be effective to them. But if that project management tool on the back end is saving data in a place that cannot access your other cloud services, or if your other cloud services can't speak to that project management data service, you're going to find yourself all of a sudden having to look in multiple different places in order to find the information that you have. And what you get then is, the 100 monkeys in an office writing Shakespeare. You got a lot of people just tapping away at their keyboards trying to move this data where it needs to be. And what comes of that is another term, specific more to our industry than yours, which is cloud sprawl. And this is something that's very, very dangerous, because when you get all of these silos, you get all of this cloud sprawl, all of these different pieces of information in different places, that's when you're going to run into your inefficiencies. So what you need to do is make sure that your cloud softwares are talking to each other, to your headquarters, to any on-premise sites or services that you're using, and to your people, so that when a change is made, much like Marshall had mentioned earlier with blueprints, which is a very mature section of cloud for construction right now, that those are then immediately sending out signals to all of these other systems or to your one source of truth to let people know that, hey, a change was made. That might have to hit accounting. That might have to meet your build team. That might mean you have to order something new. If all of a sudden your original design for something didn't work and you need 14 more pieces of metal in order to make something work, you're going to be putting your business in a position where, rather than having this be unknown to, let's say, your ordering team, your purchasing team, if this is unknown to them, that can put you back a week, especially with supply chains. As mentioned earlier, it might put you back 90 days. If these systems are talking to each other and you can truly avoid cloud sprawl by doing correct data governance, that would be automatically updated. They're going to know immediately when you make the change to the plans that this stuff needs to be ordered, and you don't have the downtime. Construction crews sitting on their helmets trying to figure out what they can do in order to keep moving while they wait for this stuff. So you really don't want that siloed data. You need to make sure that everything is talking together and that your clouds are either a single cloud or that they can talk to each other. I know, Marshall, I believe you actually have a fairly specific example of something you've run into in your past office.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I worked quite a bit in customer-facing construction, where we were building out, significant sized data centers for businesses, and everything was very bid-centric. And that meant that we had to have a lot of project management, a lot of oversight with regards to resources and materials that were being delivered on these sites to build out these data centers. So I think what you're saying, John, is dead on. You know, we use cloud technology for these resources, more specifically the data that we were sharing internally. However, it was getting siloed, and it took us a little bit to actually understand that we needed to start blending those silos together because it was hurting us on the back end. The example would be, you know, we had our tool that was, you know, identifying the allocation of the resources, the people who were on the projects doing the work, what their hours were going to be dedicated to the job, then the material that we were going to use. But the problem was all that information was actually siloed away from the invoicing and billing information, where we kept, okay, this is how we're going to bill and invoice our clients, but we weren't able to bridge that gap. And eventually we got there, but we went through some growing pains because it was separate. Another thing was, you know, our project management aspect on the back end, you know, allocating those hours and having them review these projects, that all of their processes were actually siloed in a different cloud tool versus the tool where we had all of the material identified and the resources that were being allocated to actually build what we were looking to build. So you're absolutely right. You know, it's great to have all that information be accessible from the cloud, but when it is separate and we're not making it cohesive and blending those different silos together, it can be a challenge.
Yeah, so I think this ties back to what you had said earlier too, with version control. One of the big things that we see is these little changes are not being communicated well, are not moving through systems, and are not coming back into the field. So it's not just about having access to that file, it's about having access to the right file.
So a lot of great information there, gentlemen. But basically, you know, just to kind of unpack that, the cloud is great, but, you know, making sure that it's set up properly is probably very important, right? And making sure that systems talk and, you know, you can communicate to the different departments so everybody can execute on their task at hand. So saying all of that, any specific cloud solutions being, you know, best or most effective for what you guys see in construction on-site management?
Yeah, so we use a lot of different cloud softwares, and the problem with your question is that there's a different software that's going to be right for different companies all over the place. So I can't give you a single definition of, oh, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. This is definitely what your company should be needing. But the key is to make sure that you're vetting all of your cloud softwares, because cloud, although it is what we lead with and it is what is going to help move construction forward into the future, it's not perfect right now. It's not going to be for every construction company. So to get off of promoting cloud for a little bit here, we just want to talk about how sometimes speed can be king over cloud. So what you're going to find is that right now, in our current state, there are hybrid environments that actually work for construction better than cloud-centric ones. And the reason for this is simply what I said before. It's speed. So you're dealing with very large CAD files, and right now there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, a lot of different ways that construction companies probably are doing it. So your company might use things like RDS servers, where essentially you're running your AutoCAD on servers at headquarters and finding ways to access them. A lot of companies are doing this through things like VPN tunnels. None of that is cloud. You know, that is your basic on-prem, what we've always done in the past. Now, where we start seeing hybrid come into play, and where, you know, a hybrid solution might be better than a cloud-centric solution, is, for example, if you have, let's say, more than 5 different locations, or just more than 5 different job sites where you have people working on that AutoCAD. All of a sudden, you're managing one VPN tunnel per person per location. So anybody who's accessing that data, your IT team all of a sudden has this huge stack of VPN tunnels that they need to access. Each one of those can be a fairly large security concern. So one thing that a hybrid solution as compared to a cloud-centric solution can do is actually use the cloud to help you version control and move that data without having to necessarily use a VPN, which gives you a lot more speed because you're still running your data at your headquarters on a big beefy server that could run those AutoCAD files. And essentially all your people out in the field are doing is using the cloud to get a screen. Their mobile device is not actually doing any of the computation. It just has that instantaneous, like what we're doing right now in the webinar. I'm showing you what this computer is doing. So that's one area where you can get a lot of feedback by moving not to a cloud-centric platform, but to a hybrid platform. The other thing that you've probably seen in construction, and another salesperson like myself has probably reached out to you about, is that you can actually put devices in each location now that will do that version control for you. So if, let's say, you are a construction company that is cloud first and your data and your CAD files are in the cloud, first of all, you're buying a lot of cloud space, so good for you. But these devices that are physical devices on location, what they do is actually download and version control those files from the device, meaning that essentially all they are transferring to and from the cloud is the delta, is the changes that you're making, meaning that your people can effectively work on site or at a different location or wherever they might be, and they don't have to continuously upload and download these. Some CAD files are gigabytes. I mean, depending on what it is that you're working on. So you're not spending 5-10 minutes every time you try to make an upload or a download, especially if you're working on something like wireless data. I know my wireless carrier likes to give out when I'm out in the middle of nowhere doing things. You're not always building right next to a cell tower. So making sure that you can do these changes with as little data transfer as possible is going to allow your people to work much quicker, much more effectively than doing like a full cloud solution. So we're still using the technology, but we're going to take some of the things that we learned in the old school way, how you've been doing business, and make sure that they can effectively keep your people running.
Understood. So basically, to sum all of this up, right, or that piece there is, it's important to say that find a good tech provider or business, partner that has the best interest in your organization. Right? Because although you may be in construction, it doesn't mean that your organization is the same as the one across town, right? So your infrastructure, the way that you're set up, the way that you communicate, maybe there's some work from home in your environment, right? It's probably best to have a business partner that has a good understanding of how your business operates. Fair to say, John?
Okay. Yeah. And as I had mentioned before, Impact does that through our virtual chief information officers, but if you're not working with us, just make sure that you do have a person who understands the business well enough so that they can help guide you along this journey, because it's ever changing. And these things, they change monthly, unfortunately. Sometimes fortunately, sometimes unfortunately. But yes, having that person in place who can do that for your organization is paramount.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So sticking to the cloud piece and really looking at cloud safety, Marshall, I got to assume that the cloud safety is part of the equation, right?
I mean, it has to be, absolutely. Really before we, keep going into the cloud and getting specific with that, it's really talking about who or what are we protecting ourselves from within this vertical, right? Everyone's hearing about these, cyber attacks, some of these large enterprise entities that are getting compromised, but sometimes it's hard to understand, well, why do they care about what I have, specifically construction? Well, cyber attacks in construction, in part, is being amplified by the amount of confidential proprietary information that we're storing digitally and sharing across these projects. So as I mentioned beforehand, you're looking at intimate details of how these buildings, some of these stadiums, and the technological advancements that are being used are being implemented. Well, if a bad actor gets into that environment, the first thing they're going to do is determine how they can compromise that building or that environment by leveraging the technology. And since we're digitally storing this and sharing this information, and it is sometimes confidential or proprietary, it's very, very important to make sure we're focusing on where we're storing that. If we're using the cloud, how are we backing that up? And the other thing to really think about is with the infrastructure and the financial accounts, as well as the data of just the employees who are working at that organization, in addition to projects and business sensitive information, all of that is at risk. So, as we're making sure we're focusing on safety, whether it's in the cloud or just specifically focusing on construction, which I know we'll touch on a little bit more about how these bad actors are getting into these environments, the number of cybersecurity attacks in construction are actually really increasing and growing exponentially. So it really is important for us to make sure that, you know, the safety of what you're sharing and the information that you have is protected. What do you think about
Absolutely.
that, John?
Yeah, and as some of you may or may not have seen, the White House has come out with 16 different industries where cybersecurity needs to be paramount, where all of a sudden these things need to be told to the government if there's an attack or anything like that. And while construction was not one of them, infrastructure was. So the things that you're working on fall into a lot of these buckets that are under direct attack from other nation states, bad actors, things like that. And construction sites can be particularly vulnerable. The reason for this is, as I had mentioned before, a lot of times your people are working on temporary Wi-Fi. They're working on cellular data. They're working at Starbucks' Wi-Fi across the street because they can't get their cellular data or temporary Wi-Fi. You know, there's all these different things that are not 100% secure that your people are working on. So what you need to do is make sure that you have layers in place so that if for any reason, let's say you're using a fake Starbucks Wi-Fi that a bad actor set up, that your PPO is grabbing all of your people's data, the second they try to do anything with that, you need another layer of your security to let your business know, hey, somebody's in here that shouldn't. And this really ties back to some of the data governance things we talked about earlier in this webinar, where knowing who can access the data. Because if all of a sudden somebody is accessing that data that is not on, let's say, an approved list or a white list, or it's just someone who's never accessed it before and a yellow flag isn't raised somewhere for someone to take a look at that, you're opening yourself up to some of these breaches that we've seen recently. And everyone knows that phishing has been the number one attack strategy for the last couple of years. But some of the number twos are simply just finding ways into your network through some of these less secure network connections.
Got it. Okay. So enable your workforce to be more efficient, right? Give them the technology, put it in place, right? Get information and data faster. So I think there's a common misconception around cloud and why having your data in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that your organization is secure. John, can you talk to me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a false narrative going around right now that somehow cloud equals compliance. That's unfortunately not the case. Just because your data is in the cloud doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be compliant. What it does mean is that you have a different set of compliance requirements and that your cloud provider needs to also be meeting those requirements. So what this kind of ties back to is you can have cybersecurity without compliance. You know, even if your construction company is not necessarily one of those 16 industries labeled by the White House, you're working close enough with them that you are going to get sucked into that. So you have to build that sort of compliance into your business using your cybersecurity parameters. So you're not going to go out and get CMMC certified. You're not going to go out and get HIPAA certified, but you need to have the correct cybersecurity layers in place so that if anything happens, you're not downstream getting caught in some of those compliances from your vendors, from your clients, from the people who do business with you. The other big piece there is cloud also doesn't equal compliance, because what happens if your data in the cloud disappear? Let's say your cloud vendor, whatever service it is that you use them for, something happens and it's just gone. How would you even know? How fast would you know? You know, what is kind of going on in that situation? Can you prove that the data you had that disappeared wasn't used in a malicious way? So again, all of a sudden you're getting kind of sucked into some of these compliance things that require a certain level of cybersecurity that is a little bit above and beyond what you see out of your average construction company. So making sure that this is top of mind. A great example of this, I apologize, not construction, is when you heard about the big Target breach a couple of years ago. Target didn't get breached, their vendors got breached. They got pulled into that because their vendors were doing enough data transfer with them that all of a sudden they were breached. So you got to keep in mind that everyone you're doing business with, every one of your business partners, is looking at you to be secure the same way they're looking at themselves to be secure. And then on top of that, you need to prove to cybersecurity insurance agencies anymore that you have the correct cybersecurity layers, who has access to your data, and where it is. In the past, it's been very easy to check a couple boxes and say very simply, yeah, we have this. Great, give us our cybersecurity. Well, we've actually seen specific examples of travelers insurance in the last couple months actually paying out a cybersecurity policy, and then when doing the forensics after an attack, going back to that company and suing them for their money back because they had checked a couple of boxes that they weren't doing. The big one was that they had checked that they were doing multi-factor authentication on every one of their servers. Turns out there was one that wasn't. Guess which one got breached? So cybersecurity insurance is going to be another really big driving force on this. And to make sure that you can lower your premiums and be in a much better spot, you have to have those cybersecurity layers in place.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we can, and you made a good point about, when you said target, I think that really speaks to the construction vertical, specifically when it comes to these general contractors who have many, many different subcontractors that they are working with. There's different specialists within the construction vertical, whether they be electric or plumbing or drywall or whatever it may be, specifically on some of these larger builds. And the coordination of that is paramount. But what I think we really need to focus in on is those general contractors are making sure that there's limits of liability that are being checked off for those subcontractors. And the standardization specifically around cybersecurity is now going way up. And the GCs are having to hold these subcontractors to a higher level of standardization specifically around cybersecurity. Because again, like you mentioned, John, if one of those sub vendors ends up getting hacked or the bad actor gets in through them, the GC is ultimately responsible for that project being client facing, and they're going to have, and if it gets, and they're compromising their client, not only is the GC in trouble, but then we're filtering right straight down, and then there's going to be a share of liability there that no one really wants. I think the other thing that really is important for us to talk a little bit more about is how these bad actors are really getting in and how that's contributing to, unfortunately, the downtime and business interruption. Because we've talked about this a little bit about project load and the length of time that these projects are going. They have deadlines. The last thing that a construction vertical really wants to do is focus in on not hitting the deadlines and having overages or additional time. The goal is, when in those bidding processes, you have X amount of time to accomplish this task. So downtime is not going to help. In fact, it's going to deter, these construction organizations from being able to accomplish that date, right? The other thing that really impacts that downtime and interruption really can be the breach of intellectual property. We talked about phishing. Construction companies hold a lot of highly sensitive blueprints, schematics, information in their computer systems. Well, breaching these computer systems would really result in a major reputational damage and potential lawsuits, but also, again, that trickle-down effect of not just the GCs, but the subcontractors getting into a decent amount of hot water with their clients. And it's very easy for these organizations that are supporting their end clients to be susceptible to those breaches, as you mentioned, just from intellectual property and breaching in through that phishing. I think the other thing that we really have to make sure that we're focusing in on is those wire transfers that are going on from the subcontractors to the general contractors all the way up to the clients. When a bad actor is in your environment, typically we've seen they can be in there for up to 247 days, which is a healthy amount of time. They're typically, for those first third to 2/3 of that time, they're sitting and watching the transactions go on through those entities. And for a construction organization, you're looking at transfers going on from you to potentially unions, from you to the material manufacturers, or wherever you're getting the actual hardware necessary to conduct and complete your project. But also you're talking about the transferring of information to your end client, specifically financials. So what bad actors will sit and do is they'll calculate how often those transactions are happening, and they'll start just dropping in their own transactions and mimicking either a general contractor or the client as far as that exchange of transaction. And they do all of that most of the time, as John mentioned, through those phishing emails saying, oh, hey, I need this bank account, or hey, can you send me this at this point? And there's a lot of ways for them to sit and just wait and watch and extract that information. And I feel like the transfer of financials within a construction vertical is a very, very big target for these bad actors. So just something to think about. And another reason why not only do you need to evaluate mobile device management and cloud and making sure that the transfer of all that information and sharing of that documentation is secure, but you need to also make sure that each one of the vendors that's participating with you in this project from a subcontractor perspective, they are also meeting those security standards, because ultimately the responsibility is for everybody involved to make sure that that project's getting done, but you're doing it as securely as possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Marshall, John, and Mike. We're going to hop into our audience Q&A right now. So if you do still have a pending question, go ahead and drop it in the Ask Questions section. But we'll go ahead and throw the first one out. So just feel free, any of you guys, to take this question. And it says here, so going back to the mobile device management conversation, what does that look like from an IT perspective? For example, what kind of parameters can be placed on these devices?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It really depends on the profile of the person that has the device and what you want them to have access to, right? If you have, a foreman on site, they're probably going to have a lot more access to the overall network and what's being shared and viewed and distributed than somebody that's, the one who's actually, putting up the door or laying the cable or, putting out the rebar. I mean, there's a difference of profile there. And I think the best thing for an organization to do is start profiling not only who has what kind of device, what is the necessity of that person to have the device, and what can they have access to? Because if all they need is access to a blueprint technology that's indicating that they need to accomplish a job by this amount of time, like we gave the example of the door earlier, moving the door from one side of the office to the other, making it out swinging versus in swinging, and assigning that, the person that's getting assigned really only needs to have access to potentially that application and maybe a time, like a virtual timestamp of when they're on site, when they're taking their lunch, when they're back on site, versus a foreman who's going to need a lot more access to the network as far as the availability of material, looking at that, maybe that project data set where it's saying, this is the hours we have left, this is the hours we've completed so far, this is the material we have on site that we're using, this is the material we're missing. You're really profiling those people. And I think, adding the security layer into that is a little easier. Go ahead.
Real quick, Marshall, too, to add on that, it's going to depend on whether or not you own the mobile devices or if the person owns their mobile device and are just accessing your information. So that'll depend on whether or not you're putting security layers into cloud platforms that these people are accessing, or if you can do something like an Intune licensing where you have full control of that device at all times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point, John, too. There's a lot of different solutions out there, all the way down from maybe some of the tech that you have in place through a Cisco or a Meraki system that you're currently working with today, all the way down to the carriers like an AT&T or a Verizon or T-Mobile have their own, flavor of mobile device management. So it'd probably be evaluating what the best solution is for your organization based upon what information you want these people in the field to have.
Exactly.
Perfect. Thank you. To kind of piggyback off of that, we got this other question that says, if my team doesn't use mobile devices in the field, do I still need to consider cloud technology?
Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah, if I'm assuming they're using some type of laptop, right? In the field, if they're not using a mobile device, but yeah, they absolutely, would need to consider that, because it's all about speed and efficiency. If you're an on-premise, right, not to get too technical right here, but you need to log into a VPN and there's VPN challenges where they can't access documents and be efficient. It's really challenging, if you're not in the cloud to some extent, to gain that information in an easier way.
Perfect. Looks like we got one more question. So, kind of actually piggybacking off of what you said, Mike, about on-premise, it says, you said the cloud isn't right for everyone. If my team is operating off of on-premise servers, why do I need an extensive cybersecurity strategy?
For the same reason everybody needs one. Yeah, I mean, it's you're right. And so one of the things that you have with an extensive on-premise network is you have the ability, I should say, to really build up your walls around the organization because there's less data transfer. So there are certain security advantages to that, certainly. However, when we're talking about security, and this is not construction specific in any way, shape, or form, but the fact of the matter is if someone wants to get in these days, they will eventually. Now, I don't know if you're a major target or not, or if there's any reason someone specifically would be coming after you, or if there was a door or window left open on your network somewhere and somebody found it. All of these things that talk about cloud security apply to your on-premise security as well. However, traditional IT teams tend to have a slightly better grasp on how to do that piece of security because they have been for much longer. So a little bit of a loaded question there because I'm going to fall back on cybersecurity is going to be very important for every company, no matter what it is that you're doing.
I think that's a great point, John. I mean, when we gave the examples of, the fraudulent wire transfers and the bad actors being in your environment, or, what it could cause as far as downtime or the different breaches with the sensitive material, that really was universal to on-prem or cloud. John mentioned if they want to get in, they're going to get in. Just because you're on-prem doesn't mean that you're not exposed to phishing attacks. You're not, there's a lot of different ways that these bad actors can get in. And sometimes it's like John said, simply a door or a port that was left open on the network with, network administrators have a lot going on. Sometimes depending on, how many of them there are, they're under heavy strain, and there can be shortcuts that can be taken. It's pretty eye-opening when you sit with some of our partnered organization .security, and they have those guys who are in there that are literally, able to go in and get into pretty much anything. It's pretty amazing and eye-opening to see how they can do it and how fast they can do it. And it doesn't matter if it's on the cloud or on-prem, to be honest. So definitely a way, you can evaluate that is just, looking at organizations that can provide these assessments and just reaffirming that your on-prem solution is as robust and that your cybersecurity posture is as good as it needs to be. But you have to remember it's continuous. With cybersecurity, it's not if, it's when. And you continuously have to make sure that you're enhancing that environment and that posture. Evaluation is a great way to do that.
Yeah, I would just add to the only final thing there is it's always good to get an outside, eye on what's going on. Sometimes, we're managing our environment for so long, and it happens everywhere, no matter what department it's in, and you kind of get in that silo, right? And you don't have a true eye-opening, what's actually going on in our environment until you have somebody take a look, right? Nobody's perfect by any extent, but what you want to do is just make sure that any of those holes that are open, are filled. So it's always good to have that. And then you can understand when you have a solid operational piece, that's the best time to put in a cybersecurity strategy. And that could be different for any type of organization, depending upon what the need is. So with a lot of that, with everything being said, I think from a big takeaway perspective from our conversation today, here's how I would break it down: that effective construction on-site management means empowering your mobile workforce to operate more efficiently and more securely. Right. Second thing would be, you accomplish that through mobile device management, having the right cloud solution, data governance, and cloud safety, which is a lot of what we talked about today. The right cloud solutions are not just secure and fast, but they also talk to each other. So you don't want to end up with that cloud sprawl that we spend a good amount of time talking about, right? If you're going to do a lot of these things. Sometimes you need to have a hybrid solution because the cloud, again, isn't always the best strategy from a large file perspective and being able to gain stuff quickly. So you need to really have that understanding of what is our business, how do we operate, and really get that true consultative approach to the organization that you have to say, hey, what is best for us? And, I always look at it in three different ways. What's the technical, operational, and financial benefits to the strategy that we're going towards moving forward? And then the last thing, having your data in the cloud doesn't necessarily mean that it meets regulation compliance, right? So every industry, and we're talking specifically about construction, has some type of compliancy that you need to follow. So you need to ensure from a cybersecurity measure that all those things are in place to stay protected, from an on-site perspective. So with all that being said, we would just like to thank everybody for joining. We hope that this was beneficial. And we'd also like to add that if you do have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to your Impact Networking account manager. Thanks so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.